She.
Hi, everyone. We're just admitting everyone into the room. Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for people to join.
Okay.
I'm going to get rid of the waiting room.
Rabbi or Adrian, can you unmute Deborah Goldschmidt and Abigail Leibel, please?
Do you want screen or speaker view?
Okay. Everybody who I think should be co-hosts who need to be. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to be here and to be together finally virtually again and to celebrate one of our favorite people in our congregation and our community and who also has now his voice and his writing has reached far beyond our own synagogue and our own community. And it's really our honor and our pleasure to learn together today with Aaron Leibel and read some of his newest book together and to have the opportunity to share and ask questions and dialogue with him and Bonnie, I hope, and his daughters about his experiences and their lives in Israel. And really, it's wonderful. And we all know Aaron through the synagogue in such a wonderful way as our gabbai and always involved in our services and the board and all of the functions of our synagogue. But Aaron also is a prolific writer and editor and worked at many publications, including the Jerusalem Post and the Washington Jewish Week, and has so much experience in the Jewish world and in the world of journalism. And so it's our pleasure to learn with you and from you again today. And to introduce Aaron, please welcome Steve Drachman, who is Aaron's publicist.
Hi, thanks very much for joining us this morning. I'm Stephen Drachman. I'm not actually Aaron's publicist. I work for Chickadee Prince Books, which is the publisher of Aaron's new memoir, Figs and Alligators. As you may know, Aaron's a veteran journalist. He made his name as a journalist in Israel, where he immigrated in the 1970s and where he covered the country's events during some of its most tumultuous times. This journey to Israel and back and what happened in between is the topic of Figs and Alligators, which is really a terrific mix of personal story and history, all told in a conversational and witty style, which has received rave acclaim in Kirkus reviews. I think the New Hampshire Jewish Post and the Jerusalem Post, among many other papers. And it was also excerpted this week in Tablet, the really prominent online magazine, which you may have seen if you follow Aaron on Facebook, has created rage on the internet. It's rage. People are angry. They're very angry about that because they read the headline and misunderstood it. So, but I'm hoping as the publisher that rage and controversy will sell some books, even if it's misunderstood. Aaron will read some selections from the book. And by the way, it's a very nice piece in Tablet. I recommend it highly to read the whole thing and not just the headline. Aaron will read some selections from the book, and then you'll have a chance to ask questions. You can send your questions. I think we're going to have you just send them out on the public chat, or you could send them directly to the rabbi if you wish. Also, importantly, autographed copies of the book are for sale during the event. They cost $12.99 plus $1.50 shipping, which is a bargain, particularly since you get Aaron's autograph on that. I'm going to send a message out during the event. You can send a message to, you'll be able to send a message to orders@chickadeeprince.com, or you can message me during the event with your email address if you want to order it. So now that we've gotten all of that out of the way, we'll turn this over to Aaron.
Hi, everybody. So as you've gathered, my name is Aaron Leibel. I used to be a journalist, and I've written a book called Figs and Alligators about our time in Israel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch of the book. Facts only. And then I'm going to read some excerpts from the book. Oh, I forgot to introduce Bonnie. This is Bonnie. Can you see Bonnie? Yeah, there's Bonnie, my wife, and our daughters. Hopefully, or I see one of them anyway, are also on the Zoom. And when I finish, as I said, I'm going to give a thumbnail sketch of the book. Then I'm going to read a few excerpts from the book, and then we'll throw everything open to questions, and you can ask questions to me, to Bonnie, or to the daughters. Okay, so let's begin. So in September 1972, Bonnie, our two daughters, then we had two daughters, Lauren, who was age 5, and Deborah, who was age 6 weeks, and I got on a Boeing 707 airliner at Kennedy Airport, and we flew to Israel to make Aliyah, to go live in the Jewish state. Neither Bonnie nor I had ever visited Israel. It was simply too expensive for us to have made a visit, stayed there a week or two, come back, and then bought tickets to go again. Not only that, but I had never been out of the United States before then. Bonnie had some experience as a world traveler. Her father was a missile engineer. And so for 2 summers in the early 1950s, Bonnie, her 2 brothers, and her mother lived in New Mexico while her father and the other scientists and engineers from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory were trying to make the Talos missile. That was a Navy missile work. And during that time, Bonnie visited Mexico. So you can see she was a real experienced international traveler. Anyway, when we landed, the first place that we lived in Israel was a absorption center called Mevaseret Zion that was located in the hills west of Jerusalem. Very interesting place. We lived there for 3 months, and then I got a job at the Israeli Health Ministry as a healthcare manpower planner. And so we left the absorption center and rented our first apartment in Israel in a neighborhood called Givat Tzarfatit, or French Hill. French Hill, the neighborhood was located on territory that Israel had captured from the Jordanians during the 1967 Six-Day War. So Israel considers this neighborhood and the other neighborhood that that I'll tell you about later, that we lived in, to be neighborhoods of the city of Jerusalem, while the Arabs continued to call both of them settlements. Anyway, we lived there. We lived in French Hill for 10 months, and then we decided that we wanted to go live on a kibbutz. So we went to Kibbutz Kfar Giladi, which, if you know Israel, is in the Upper Galilee. And the Upper Galilee is it's a finger of land that juts up between Lebanon and Syria. The kibbutz was about a mile from the Lebanon border, between Metula, which is the last stop in Israel. It's actually on the Lebanon border, and Kiryat Shmona, another small town. And it was across the Hula Valley from the Golan Heights. We lived there for 4 years, and then we decided to go back to the city. So we went back to Jerusalem, and this time we rented an apartment in a neighborhood called Neve Yaakov, which is the northernmost neighborhood in Jerusalem. And we lived there for the rest of the time that we were in Israel. During our stay, we raised our children, we learned Hebrew, and I served in the Israeli army. Professionally, Bonnie was a nurse on the kibbutz where we lived. And then for the next 10 years, when we came back to Jerusalem, she worked in a hypertension research unit in Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus. For the last couple of months that we lived in the country, she worked at a small Jerusalem hospital. While we were there, she earned a master's in public health from Hebrew University, and she got a certificate as a systems analyst from the Israeli Ministry of Labor. It's this trying to pay for this last thing that caused us severe financial problems and led to our leaving the country. I, professionally, as I already said, I was a manpower planner for the health ministry. And then when we came back to Jerusalem, I was the night manager in the Jerusalem Plaza, which is a big hotel in the city. And then I became a journalist. I was a writer for Newsview magazine, which was a small English language publication out of Tel Aviv. And when Newsview went bankrupt, I went to work for the Jerusalem Post. I was also a freelance writer for a newspaper called the Middle East Times, which is published in Cyprus and is sold in the Arab world. And I also wrote for several American Jewish newspapers, and I worked for the Associated Press in Tel Aviv for a little while. So that's it. That's our story in a very short way. So now I'm going to read you a few excerpts from the book. So the first one will deal with the day of our flight to Israel and the reaction of our families. Okay. So the next morning, Bonnie, Lauren, Deborah, and I joined Bonnie's parents, Joe and Norma, and my Aunt Shirley and Uncle Sylvan in the latter's mobile home for the long trip to New York. We stopped in Philadelphia to say goodbye to my sister Rona and her husband Bruce. Our goodbyes at JFK Airport in New York later the same day were not tearful, but neither were they joyous. My family sort of understood about ending 2,000 years of living in exile, of going to live in the newly constituted Jewish state. They thought that was great for the oppressed Jews of Russia and Eastern Europe, even for Jews living in Argentina or South Africa. But American Jews? No, my family really didn't understand. So they said nothing about the wisdom of making Aliyah. And Bonnie's Christian family was completely baffled. However, sometime during that day, my Uncle Sylvan slipped me a $100 bill. I had never seen one before. That was a lot of money in 1972. And I tried to hang on to that note for emergencies as long as I could, converting it into Israeli currency only 2 years later when we desperately needed money. As it turned out, that was the last time I was to see my uncle. He was caught in an undertow and drowned while he and his family were vacationing in Florida in 1974. He was the unofficial leader of our family, and we never have gotten over his loss. No one has been able to take his place. I boarded the plane wearing my one suit. Travel was a much more formal occasion then than it is now, although I overdid it. When we left Israel to return to live in America 16 years later, my suit was still in the closet where it hung for the entire time we lived there. Israelis, with the exception of Likud politicians like Menachem Begin and men in the ultra-Orthodox community, didn't and still don't today wear such uncomfortable outfits, so unsuitable for the oppressive heat of the Middle East. We flew an El Al 707 Boeing airliner directly from New York to Tel Aviv. The trip was long and boring and awful, and caring for a 6-week-old made it even worse. And I was more than a little uneasy about what awaited us at the end of the flight. After all, living in Israel was an unknown, and unknowns tend to create anxiety. Okay. So the next excerpt I'm going to read to you excerpts actually have to do with Hebrew and some of the problems, some of them funny, I hope, that we encountered. So at the airport, we also discovered the difficulty of reconciling the English and Hebrew languages when the clerk had to write down our names. There was no problem with Aaron, which of course comes from Hebrew and is Aharon in that language. You'll see in a little while, there actually are problems with that name. But anyway, Bonnie, however, was entirely different. Her name should be written with the Hebrew letters Bet, Nun, and Yud. But the vowels written underneath the Hebrew letters in diaspora prayer books to help those unfamiliar with the language to pronounce the words don't exist in Israel. So seeing those letters without the vowels, Israelis would say Benny, the shortened version of Benjamin, a very popular name in the Jewish state. Obviously, writing Bonnie's name that way would lead to many problems and probably some hilarious misunderstandings as well. To avoid those, the clerk inserted the Hebrew letter Vav between the Bet and the Yun. No more mistaking Bonnie for a man, but Bet Vav Nun Yud comes out as Boni, which is the way she is known to friends in Israel to this day who don't know English. Okay. Oh, we're not finished with the language yet. So I probably shouldn't say this, but this paragraph that I'm going to read you, I didn't write very well. And so I put the facts a little bit out of order. So I'm going to correct that in this presentation. So if you've ever been to Israel, you know that Israelis are always in a hurry, whether it's on the roads or with the language, they're always trying to get somewhere quickly. One of those words, there are all kinds of abbreviations and contractions in Hebrew. And one of the words that Israelis try to say quickly is my name. So as I said earlier, my name should be pronounced Aharon, but no Israeli says Aharon. That takes too long. Instead, they say Aaron. Okay, much quicker. So let me read to you the problem that came about with that. Not everything went smoothly on the language front. When I was introduced to Lauren is our oldest daughter, to Lauren's classmate on the kibbutz, I meant to say my name was Aharon, Hebrew for Aaron. Actually, I meant to say Aaron. However, I was nervous speaking in Hebrew in public, and so instead of putting the stress on the first syllable, I placed the emphasis on the second, which means closet in Hebrew. The children found that mistake hilarious, saying over and over again, Abba shel Lauren hu Aaron. Lauren's dad is a closet. I was less amused. Language influenced our relations with our children. At first, we tried to speak Hebrew at home with them, and Bonnie and I would speak English if we didn't want the kids to understand what we were saying. That only worked for a short time and really not very well at all. For the first 5 months of her life, Lauren's native tongue was English. Very quickly, Deborah, with help from Lauren, understood what we were saying. So our attempt to speak English helped Deborah to learn a second language. We spoke some Hebrew at home and some Heblish, a combination of the two languages. Neither Hebrew nor English language scholars would have been happy listening to our conversations. They would have heard sentences such as, Ima ma yesh la'ochat erev, which means, Mom, what are we having for dinner? And Bonnie might reply, kush kush, scrambled eggs, salat, salad, and mashed potatoes. Or a daughter would ask, Ima, efo samta de michnasayim sheli? Mom, where did you put my pants? But Bonnie might reply, tistakli, look, in your closet. Or even worse, we would combine the two languages into one horrible word. You might have heard in our house, for example, Matai anaknu yotziming. When are we going out? Okay. Um, the Yom Kippur War broke out about a year after our arrival, and I'm going to read a section about that. Okay. We were visiting our friends, Neil and Sandy Katz, in their apartment located in the same French Hill community in which we lived when the air raid sirens went off at 2 p.m. on that Yom Kippur day in 1973. Fearing that the bombs would start falling, in reality, the sirens were meant to be a kind of signal to Israeli reserve soldiers, the only way to communicate with those in synagogue and others who wouldn't listen to the radio on that holy day. I ushered our daughters into the bomb shelter in the Katz's building. All residents in Israel have shelters. That evening, there was a complete blackout in Jerusalem. At about 8 o'clock, I heard a knock on the front door. It was Chavetzelet Farber from my unit at the health ministry. She had walked about a mile, mostly uphill and completely in the dark, from her home in Ramat Eshkol, a nearby neighborhood, to our apartment to find out how the new immigrants were faring in their first war. As I mentioned earlier, as people, Israelis are wonderful. On the day that the war broke out, my boss at the Ministry of Health, who was an American, strapped a holster with a pistol to his belt, got in his car and headed north, presumably to do battle with the enemy. He was, of course, stopped at a military checkpoint and sent home. Back at the office, he began pressing his staff to volunteer in the war effort. I didn't need much pressure. As almost all the young men were in uniform fighting in the war, I, at 31, stood out very much from the women, children, older men, and ultra-Orthodox men of all ages seen on the streets of Jerusalem. I felt guilty about being at home with Bonnie and the girls, while so many Israelis were risking their lives to defend our country. So I volunteered in a program in which government workers were sent to frontline civilian settlements to help out. By chance, I was sent to Kibbutz Misgav Am, located at the top of the mountain overlooking Kfar Giladi, which was the kibbutz that we were going to go live on. But my usefulness was very limited. I had no military experience and so couldn't do guard duty, nor was my Hebrew advanced enough to be assigned as a lookout because I'd have to report what I saw in Hebrew. Not knowing what to do with me, the head of security assigned me to guard a spot on the kibbutz where explosives were buried. They were to be detonated should the enemy break through the kibbutz defenses. I was to tell Israelis at the kibbutz to stay away from that spot. That assignment was not only ludicrous, but boring as well. Therefore, I spent several days on the kibbutz during the war, reading the Jerusalem Post, and then using the paper in a way the editors never imagined, to kill flies. The next excerpt I'm going to read to you is about the birth of our third child on the kibbutz, I think. No, in a minute, I'll find it, don't worry. Here we go. Our most important, quote, acquisition, end quote, while we were living in Kfar Giladi was our third child, who was born in 1975. I had convinced Bonnie to have another baby because I wanted a son, perhaps the only time in our marriage that I persuaded her to do something against her will. Bonnie went into labor during the day while I was working in the apple orchard. Someone got word to me that she had been taken to nearby Sfat Hospital. I grabbed the panel truck used in the orchard and sped to the hospital, anxious to meet my new son. But this was in the pre-ultrasound era. In her room, I found Bonnie in bed laughing, and daughter number 3, Abigail, or Abby in English, named after my beloved Uncle Sylvan David Michelson, resting comfortably under an infrared lamp. Let me state categorically that I wouldn't trade daughter number 3 or daughters number 1 or 2 for that matter for all the sons in the world. When I got back to the kibbutz, our friend Uzi Kroll took me to the lounge of the kibbutz guest house, which is a hotel, and brought the two of us a few beers to celebrate my child's birth. Although Uzi was effusive in his congratulations, he was subtly criticizing me for being Abu Banot, a slang expression combining Hebrew and Arabic to mean father of daughters. Real men, of course, have sons. I always thought that this attitude was somewhat foolhardy on his part, because his record in the child derby up to that time was 2 girls, no boys. In this case, I was proved prophetic, for Uzi and his wife Kathy added 3 more girls to their family, and alas, no sons. Okay, I'm going to now read you about a very interesting reserve duty I did. The most interesting reserve duty that I had during the mid-1970s was at the Good Fence. A civil war was raging in Lebanon, pitting the Palestinians and most other Muslims against that country's Christians. During the war, the southern part of the country with many Christian inhabitants became cut off from the rest of Lebanon. As a result, many of those people became unemployed. Israel set up a program in which Christian residents of the South could work in Kiryat Shmona and on neighborhood farms and return home in the evening. The entrance into Israel for those workers was called Hagadera Tova, the Good Fence. There were 3 positions for Israeli troops to guard in that part of the fence. We were in the northernmost position, sleeping and spending off-duty time in an above-the-ground concrete bunker. Across the border from our living quarters was a lone house. One of our Arabic-speaking soldiers began talking with the people living in that house, and eventually cross-border commercial ties were established. We would throw bags of tomatoes and cucumbers over the fence, and they would throw bags of labneh, a creamy cheese made from strained yogurt, over the barrier in return. Both sides were very pleased with this small-scale international trade. However, an incident marred the commercial venture. One thrown bag of vegetables got caught in the electric fence, setting off an alarm. The Army scouts who came to investigate the incursion were not amused. On the Lebanese side of the fence was a road on which Christian militia soldiers drove. One of the Israeli soldiers serving with me was from Soviet Georgia, but the communist authorities in the Soviet Union apparently had been unable to stifle his entrepreneurial spirit. He somehow managed to speak to one of those soldiers, probably in Hebrew, which some Christian soldiers had picked up working with Israelis secretly in Lebanon. And shortly thereafter, he was in business. The war had created chaos in Lebanon, and among its many manifestations, no taxes were charged or paid on imported American cigarettes. In Israel, cigarettes from the United States were heavily taxed, both to support the Israeli cigarette makers and to cut down on spending valuable dollars on such unnecessary luxuries. In spite of the high duty charged on American cigarettes, or maybe because that gave people smoking them high status, if you could afford American cigarettes, you must be wealthy. They were much in demand. The Georgian Israeli soldier did very well buying the cigarettes without the duty charges and selling them in Israel for much less than the same product cost with full taxes paid. And finally, I'm going to read you about something that Bonnie did. As I mentioned earlier, she earned a master's degree in public health from Hebrew University, and she had to do a thesis for her degree. So that helped spark her interest in computers. For her thesis, Bonnie did a study that would benefit her research unit and kept her close to home. Incidences of hypertension in Neve Yaakov. Researchers in her unit had noticed that many people from our neighborhood had high blood pressure. Many were from the Soviet republics in Central Asia, and Bonnie hoped to find a correlation between incidence of hypertension and immigrants from that region. However, she was unable to find such a relationship. In the course of doing the study in 1981, she had to use the mainframe computer at the Ein Kerem campus of Hebrew University, which meant lots of running around the city to the computer's terminals and back. While she was struggling with that computer and punch cards, one of the docs at Hadassah brought in a copy of Time magazine with a personal computer, Lisa, and a mouse on the cover. Bonnie read the article and was hooked. She wanted to learn more about these computers that were so powerful yet so small that they fit on a desk. She haunted the used bookstore in Jerusalem, buying old copies of computer magazines and reading them from cover to cover. In addition to her work with patients and statistics, she also typed all the English correspondence from her department. When she read that these new computers had word processing programs, she realized the machines would be a boon for her and others at the hospital who typed. Bonnie became convinced that personal computers were the wave of the future, especially if those machines could do the statistical analysis and replace mainframe computers. And she began to badger her boss to buy one of those machines for their research unit. He refused. However, a donor, she's not sure who, put up the money, and the internal medicine department of Hadassah Mount Scopus had the first PC at Mount Scopus, almost surely the first in the two Hadassah hospitals, and probably the first in any Israeli hospital. The Apple IIe came to the internal medicine department in boxes, and someone put the boxes in a secretary's office. Bonnie was told, "You wanted a computer? Here it is." She had to put it together and taught herself to set it up and use it. Then she had to teach physicians and secretaries how to use it as a word processor. Serves her right for trying to do good for her unit and the hospital. Okay, I'm done. So, we have any questions, comments?
And we've got a couple of questions to start this off with. So I'll toss these out. If people have questions that you'd like to ask Aaron based on the readings or just anything that you're interested in, please either message it to me or to the rabbi or even to everyone. You can message it to everyone if you like. So first question, Aaron, when you first thought about writing this memoir, was there any particular event that came to mind right away that you were eager to get down on paper?
I'll be happy to answer the question, but I just want to say that insofar as questions are concerned, if you have any questions for Bonnie, for my daughters, or for me, they're all legitimate. Okay.
Thanks.
So did I have any particular? No, I don't think so. Actually, what happened was after I retired in 2015, I continued to write articles and book reviews for the Jerusalem Post and for Washington Jewish Week. And one day no, excuse me, I wanted to say something else. So after I retired, I had always wanted to write a novel. And so I wrote a novel, and then I spent about a year trying to find a publisher, and I failed. And I decided I would never do something foolish like that again, to self-publish. I mean, I self-published the book. Incidentally, some of the people at my synagogue read the novel that I wrote, and I want them to know they're members of a very exclusive club. Anyway, so I vowed that I would never do that again. But maybe 2 years ago, I was reviewing a book, and the book must not have been very good because my mind started to wander, and I started to type. So as I said, I never wanted to self-publish again, but I had a friend who had a friend. I have a friend who has a friend who's a publisher, and this person agreed to take a look at what I was doing. So I continued to work. At first, he was pretty enthusiastic, but he lost interest. So I'd already written the book. I certainly didn't want to send the book to dozens of publishers as I did before, but I did send it to 2 or 3 publishers, fortunately, one of which was Chickadee Prince, and they accepted it. So to get specifically to your question, I don't think I had any specific event in mind when I started writing.
Let me ask this. There are few people who have asked the same question, which is, where did the book's title come from? Would you like to explain that? Because it seems perplexing to people who may not. Go ahead.
Sure. So in Hebrew, figs are teinim, and alligators are kananim, and so. Before I learned Hebrew, I noted that the similarity between the 2 words.
So this was something that would create confusion for an English speaker trying to learn how to communicate in Israel. You're going to be going to a market.
Exactly. You wouldn't want to go to a market and order a kilo of kananim, of alligators. That wouldn't be very good. No.
So what did your daughters find most surprising or unknown about your memoir? Is there anything that they learned from reading it that they hadn't known before?
So why don't you ask my daughters?
All right.
So I see one of them.
So I'll start. Hi there, I'm Abigail. I'm number 3. As we in our family, we have numbers. We don't have names anymore. And that's actually something you didn't write about, PU, the parental unit. You didn't write that you'd give us numbers, that you don't give us, that we lost our names.
That'll be for the next book. Okay?
See, there you go. So I don't think, and there wasn't anything surprising, because it's our lives. Like, I've heard these stories my whole life. But I think that so 2 things that I got from this is that my parents' lives, when it's laid out like this, is really interesting. I mean, it's sort of, it's my father's perspective, right, on our family's life, right, and we each have our own perspective, and so that was really interesting to read his perspective. And again, that their lives are really, they're interesting, the things that they came across, and the choices that they made were pretty amazing. So it was very enjoyable to read it.
Great. I think for everyone who's read the book, there's the same reaction in terms of enjoyment. So I hope as many people read this as possible. Remaining on this topic of your family, Aaron, you and your wife went to Israel and then decided to return, and you knew when you went there, and it's a difficult place to settle in for many people, and many people come back. So you knew that this was an option to return. Did it occur to you that when you went there with small children at the time, that you were going to be raising Israeli kids, and they might not return with you? They might remain in Israel. Is that something that passed through your mind, and how did you feel about that when you realized that was going to happen?
Not in my wildest imagination, no. And the truth is that Bonnie and I never thought about coming back, about leaving Israel, until we ran into very serious financial problems in the late 1980s.
Can I intervene for a minute? All three of us are married to Israelis. And he just brought us here. It's his fault. We're here. And by the way, I take full credit for the title because it was I who pointed out his continued mistakes between alligators and figs.
Okay.
So how do you feel about now having created an Israeli family off in Israel while you're back here in America? Was there any mixed feelings about the fact that now you've due to your own choices you've got a family on the other side of the world?
Right. That's certainly one of the drawbacks, to us having returned, that two of our daughters and their families are still in Israel. It's not a good outcome. You're absolutely right.
But you must be a bit proud of having somewhat achieved success of returning to Israel.
Say it again.
You must be somewhat proud of the fact that the decision worked out so well for your kids.
Yeah. I think, ironically, incidentally, the two children that were born in America live in Israel, and the one that was born in Israel lives in America. I'm not sure whether that has any meaning or not, but it certainly is ironic.
That is interesting.
I miss my daughters and my grandchildren who live in Israel, but I'm pleased that they seem to be happy and well adjusted. Yes.
When you return to Israel today, do you feel two questions to this? Number one, what's different about Israel when you return, and do you think it's better or worse or a bit of both? And then number two, when you return to Israel, do you feel like an Israeli returning to Israel, or do you feel like an American visiting?
I think in the years after we came back here, that when we went back, we felt like Israelis, but I certainly don't. I won't speak for Bonnie, but no, I don't feel like an Israeli anymore. Bonnie says she does. Okay. Yeah, but it's been 30 years since we came back. It's a long time. So say what you want to say.
No, go ahead.
Okay. The country is very different than it was from the country that we lived in. It's better in the sense that the standard of living is much higher. The lives that both of my daughters live in Israel are at levels that Bonnie and I couldn't have even dreamed of when we lived there. But it's less, how can I say this? It's the close relations between people that existed when we lived there perhaps are not quite as good as they were then.
Let me ask a question, a connected question from Phil. What do you miss most about living in Israel? Is it that specific element?
I really enjoyed living in Israel. So the daily life of the country, I miss very much. But as I write in the book, I certainly don't miss the poverty. We were very poor when we lived there, and we had we had a hard time, for example, buying our children clothes, which is very difficult. So I can't say that I regret the decisions that we made.
Do you think it would? Sigla Potter is asking whether you will move back ever. If you ever consider moving back, do you think that you will?
That's something else that we thought about it for a while after we came back here. But I'm going to become an octogenarian next year, assuming I make it, and I think we're just too old to go through that again. Living in Israel is great, but it's it's really a tough job to pack all your stuff up and move to another country.
And deal with the banks and deal with the bureaucracy.
It's a hassle.
It's a hassle.
Eugene Katzman is asking about the difference in attitude that you're seeing between people in Israel today, and he wonders whether you think it's because of political differences or something else. And I would suggest maybe the increased affluence of the country may be partly a result. So what do you think is causing that?
Right, I think you're right. I think that affluence is certainly one of the causes. For example, I mean, we didn't experience this, but people on the kibbutz would tell us how they would, stay up all night and talk. But by the time that we got to the kibbutz, everyone had a television set in their home, so they stayed up and watched television. Prosperity has its costs, I guess.
Now, Carolyn is asking, I think probably because of the fact that Bonnie says, well, I still feel Israeli. What is your favorite memory of living in Israel? And why is it that you think you still feel Israeli when your husband feels like an American, not an Israeli?
The only thing that I can say is when I get off the plane at Ben Gurion and go through passport control and come out into the arrivals hall, it's like taking a deep breath and saying, I'm here. It's wonderful.
Do you think that's partly, now it was your decision, it was your idea to move to Israel now, right?
Yep.
And do you think that's maybe the enthusiasm of a Jew by choice, that when you decide to become a Jew, you maybe dive in more than those of us who don't have haven't made the decision, had the decision thrust upon us?
I don't think that I would agree with that, because don't forget, we lived there when I was, I'm just trying to think, 28 until I was about 44, which means that those were my formative years, okay? Late 20s, 30s, early 40s. That's when people form their identities and their loyalties. And for me, that's where it is. It's Israel. And that's what's important.
That's very interesting. So let me, well, hearing that, do you ever try to convince Aaron to move back? I don't want to make this too personal. I don't want to get in between the two of you. I don't want to create family rift, but I think it's interesting to everyone.
Oh, we used to talk about it an awful lot, because we had ridiculous dreams of having two homes, one here and one there. But the cost of living or buying an apartment or even living there half the time is completely prohibitive for us. So that went out the window. And
But when they make a movie out of my book, then that'll change everything, right?
If the movie does well.
If the movie does well, exactly.
So let me, really a question for both of you now. Israel is a nice place, but a tough place and a sometimes dangerous place. Was there any moment during your time there that you felt frightened? That you really said, this is crazy, why did I do this? And it's a question for both of you.
Well, I write in the book that when we landed, I was very anxious because I saw for the first time soldiers with rifles, with automatic rifles. I'd never seen anything like that before. And so I did feel a little bit worried that first day that we were in the country. I mean, insofar as living in Israel, sure, there are dangers, but there are dangers living here as well, right? Life's not a sure thing, as they say.
The only time that I was really scared was when we were living on the kibbutz and a Katyusha rocket fell on the dining hall, which was about 200 or 300 yards from our house. That was scary. But if you want to be really, really, really scared in Israel, go deal with the bureaucracy.
Here's a question from Sally. Was the Hebrew language much easier for Bonnie than Aaron? Does that factor contribute to Bonnie feeling more at home there, feeling more Israeli?
Not at all, because when we lived in Medicine, I couldn't go to Opan because Deborah was 6 weeks old, so there was no childcare. We lived in French Hill. I was home with the kids. When we went to the kibbutz, here I am, an American nurse working on the kibbutz with major, major responsibilities. And they told me, oh, don't worry about it. You'll learn during the course of your work. Well, that was extraordinarily difficult. And then when I finally was able to understand and speak Hebrew a little bit, then I went back to the secretary of the kibbutz and said, okay, now I need to go to Opan to learn how to read and write. You don't need, you already speak Hebrew, so what do you need to read and write for? So for me, it was very, very difficult. But I learned I figured out a long time ago, like a 2-year-old learns to speak, because I would hear a word and somebody would say, you know, Niar, and I'd go, duh. Yeah, no, Niar. Oh, okay. Then I'd finally figure it out. And that was the way that I learned. Aaron learns differently. He has to write things down and look at the words and memorize the words. But I didn't do it like that.
Another question for you, Bonnie. Aaron speaks so beautifully about your arrival in Israel. Can you add memories about that first week or about the trip? It's hard to imagine what it must have been like to fly to a new country with a 5-year-old and an infant.
Yes, it was scary. And I think like 2 weeks or a week before we left, there was a raid on the airport in Rome and a lot of people were killed and I was freaking out. So yeah, we went on the flight and we got there and we had to deal with all kinds of crazy stuff. And at that time, the road between the airport and the main highway to Jerusalem hadn't been finished. So the guy that took us in what they call the tender. It's like a half truck and a half car. And we went through Ramla and Lod and the kids were tired and I was tired. It was a new thing. And we got to Medicine and first of all, it was the nicest place we'd ever lived. And that includes graduate housing and all of that stuff. And secondly, when we walked in, somebody very kind had left us a packet of tea and some bread and some jelly. And that was when I cried.
Now a question for either of your currently Israeli residing daughters. You know, when you read about how difficult the experience was for your parents making Aliyah to Israel, and now knowing people who are coming to Israel all the time, do you feel that it is easier now, or do you think that it continues to be just as difficult from what you've seen in the years since? And you can both take the question if you like.
Go ahead, Bola.
I guess people think it's harder because there is a big aliyah now in the last few years from France. There are a lot of olim that coming from France, and a lot of them are going back. So I'm guessing the Israelity is not for everybody. But once you get here, I think you would like it. I like living here. But I wanted to say something about the question before you asked, or somebody asked about, is it dangerous or it's hard living here? And when I talked to my younger sister who's living in the States, my girls, I think it's much safer living here than it is in the States, even though people talk on the news that we have a bomb throwing at us and wars all the time, but in everyday life, it's much safer to live here than it is in the States. Like for instance, my girls who are now 17 and 15, when they were 10 or 11, I had problems for them when go to visit friends or stuff at night, or people at night, and coming home. It's something else, something that my younger sister, she can't, I don't think she can imagine sending her boys by themselves walking down the street to visit their friends at 10 o'clock at night. So I think it's much safer to live here than people think. And it makes it easier for parents.
You see,
Makes it
polls,
much easier for parents.
when people poll what nations people are most satisfied with their lives or the happiest, Israel, surprisingly to those of us here, it comes in near the top and comes in above America.
Yes, because yes,
But we're losing.
we have wars, that's true, and you know, during the Gulf War, I remember we said scary. I'm not saying it, but if you look at the big picture, the everyday life, it's very safe here, I feel. Depends, I guess, where you come.
Lauren, I know you want to say something, but can I just really quickly add to what?
Go ahead.
Really quickly. So just to give you perspective, Deborah's girls are 15 and 17, right? Did I get that right? And I have a 14 and a 9-year-old, and her youngest is out with her friends all the time. She walks to her friend's house, they take the bus to the beach, they hang out together all the time. Where my boy, who's 14, I have to drive him everywhere. We live near Boston. I have to drive him everywhere. He can't, there's no bus, he can't, it's just, well, I mean, for those of you, who have young children, that in the States, right, up to a certain, until they start driving, right, you're the person getting them to places, so they don't have the same freedoms that they do in Israel. So it's much safer, I think, in everyday life in Israel than it is here.
It's interesting. So switch, and thank you very much for that perspective. I think that's really, really helpful. One might say we American parents are just overprotective, but
well, I'm very overprotective. Don't get me wrong. My girls where they are all the time, but it's different. I can see they have this wonderful freedom that and I feel more mature, more responsible. The life here is different.
Now, Aaron, a question from Jesse and Rochelle. What did you like and dislike about living on a kibbutz?
Good question. Again, the personal relations were good on the kibbutz. I don't know there's anything that I didn't like about the kibbutz per se, but I don't think that I would have liked, and I think Bonnie agrees with me, I don't think that we would have liked to have spent our entire lives there. Because of personal development. I think that there's a limit to the kind of things that one can do on a kibbutz as opposed to what one can do in a city. And it is true that that there are limits to what you can do, or you often had to get permission to do certain things living on a kibbutz that you obviously you could do what you want, not living outside of the kibbutz.
Your time when you were there, reporting, who did you feel was, a figure in Israel who led the country in the right direction, made choices, decisions that you admired, and who was a figure? You may not want to answer the second question, but who was a figure during your period there that you looked at and said, well, this person is going to be disastrous for the country? And you can answer just the first one if you'd like to avoid controversy. But
well, the second one is actually easier to answer because, I mean, I hope this is not controversial, but I would say I was not a huge fan of Mayor Kahana, who incidentally I interviewed on several occasions while I lived there.
how did you find him personally, dealing with him? Meir Kahana, by the way, everybody knows who he is. I think, right? Was an extremist politician who was assassinated. I think was actually assassinated here in America. Correct.
Correct.
So he was. Meir Kahana was not his real name. I think he was originally an American. Went to Israel and started. I've forgotten the name of the party that he started, but it was so extremist, Kach Party, right? And it was so extremist that it was banned in Israel. How did you find him personally as a person talking to him?
He was a very interesting politician. I mean, I didn't know him well personally, but he was a very interesting politician in that when he spoke to Americans, he was rational. Rational within his perspective. But when he
didn't come off like a crazy person foaming at the mouth,
right,
he was able to explain his crazy ideas as though he
would say. Right, he would say the Arabs had a much higher birth rate than the Jews did, and so therefore we have to. I mean, if we allow the situation to continue, then the Arabs will become a majority, and they will do away with Israel. So we can't have this. So I'm not saying that this is acceptable, but it's not. But it's rational. Okay, maybe it's not right, but it's rational. But when he ran for a political office in Israel, he was much more, how can we say, down and dirty. He was a racist. I mean, and his appeal to his followers was racist. So as I say, his approach was different to the different people. Insofar as people that I don't know if I would say, I mean, I really admired Abba Evan, who was, I mean, I'm not saying that he should have become prime minister, but he was an extremely intelligent, extremely articulate person. You might ask Bonnie, one of Bonnie's patients was Yigal Yadin, who was really an amazing person, who was the chief of staff of the Israeli army during the War of Independence. He was an archaeologist of world renown, really a top flight archaeologist. And in 1977, he and some other people formed a new political party, and it was very successful. He was a very interesting, a very capable person, who happened to be a patient of Bonnie's when she worked at Hadassah.
At what stage, and I think we're, if everybody agrees, I think we'll probably give this maybe two more questions, maybe a third if something comes up that we just can't miss. And then this would be the point where if we weren't doing Zoom, we'd give you all wine or some other kind of alcohol, and then you'd be very cheerful and you'd buy the book. So I hope you could just imagine this, or maybe drink at your own home.
Virtual wine. Huh?
So, what was a point while you were there and you were reporting where decisions were made in Israel where you thought, well, this is disastrous, right? As a reporter talking about the political situation, particularly in something where a bad decision in Israel is always something which then puts the whole country at risk. So, is there something that you felt just really strongly against, and as you're writing about it, you're feeling, well, why can't I do something about this?
I think during the time that we were there, excuse me, the greatest failures were in the economic and financial areas, where there was always inflation in Israel, even under the Labor Party. But when the Likud, when Menachem Begin and his people took over, they didn't do a very good job economically, and so the inflation became it became unbearable. The inflation at the end, when they finally dealt with the problem, was I don't know, it was hundreds of percent a year. It was just unbelievable, the whole business. You would get your paycheck in Israel, people get paid their whole paycheck at the beginning of the month, where they did when we lived there. Okay, and so you would get your paycheck, and by the end of the month, the money would lose 10% of its value. So you can imagine the lengths that people would go to try to deal with this. I used to go to the black market and buy dollars and then sell dollars, but it didn't work. The people working in the black market, they also know that inflation is going to rise 10% by the end of the month. So there's really nothing you can do about it. So that was a real problem. And I also I'm also not wildly enthusiastic about some of the settlements that were established on the West Bank, because although I don't think the Palestinians are ready for a real peace now, they might be sometime in the future. And I think it's okay for Israel to build housing in places that it's likely to keep in the terms of a peace treaty, but I don't think it's good to build a small settlement in the middle of a huge Arab population, because I think that helps to preclude any future peace.
I think one more question. If anybody has something that you just desperately want to ask, to toss it out here, and if not, I have one more question from earlier, which relates to this issue that you said about the poverty, or the economic problem, the inflation. Is that you'll sometimes hear people say, "Oh, I'm so nostalgic for how poor Israel used to be." How much do you think that's a common thought among people of your generation? And if your daughters would like to comment on that as well, we can throw it out to them.
No, I think that there is a feeling of nostalgia for the Israel of the 1970s or 1980s, but I don't think it's for the poverty. I'm sure it's not for the poverty.
You do hear people say that. Oh, everybody was poor. We were right, building, and so it's the struggle.
So, but even people that say that, they're not saying being poor was good. They're saying that equality was good. Okay, but the actual poverty, I don't think anyone misses. I mean, you can ask, our daughters grew up, we were not prosperous while they were growing up. And they, I mean, I don't know if they want to talk about it, but they didn't have the most fashionable clothes. Let's put it that way.
Would you all like to comment on this and have the last word?
Yes, I agree. We weren't always very, very well dressed. But I'm thinking about my mother-in-law and her perspective on poverty is totally different than what we experience. So let me just for a minute describe what they did every Shabbat. Okay. They didn't have an oven in their house. They didn't have running water or a toilet either, but that's another matter. Anyways, before Shabbat, their mother would cook this huge pot and take it to the local bakery where he would keep the oven still working for Shabbat, and everybody from the same neighborhood would bring their own pot, and they would try to mark their pots with pieces of cloth to make sure that they got the right pot back afterwards. But of course, sometimes it singed and they got the wrong pot, and it was not as good as what they had put in it in the beginning. But that gives a whole new perspective on being poor, and even filling their bathtub water was an issue. They had to fill it up, heat the water, and then pour it down the drain outside. So they only took a bath once a week. So I think that thinking about that, we weren't rich, but we were okay. Yes, we had running water and our own food in the house.
Well, thank you very much to everybody for joining. I certainly enjoyed this a lot. I hope you've gotten a good sense of the book, which is it's really receiving a lot of praise, and we hope you'll all take a look at it. Rabbi, do you have anything that you'd like to say?
Yes, I would like to say that I enjoyed this very much. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Steve, and thank you, Bonnie, and everyone who participated. I've always had dreams of moving to Israel, but they don't need a whole lot of rabbis in Israel. And maybe in 36 years, I'll be fortunate, like Rabbi Landman, to make Aliyah. And it's so funny listening to you and to reading some of these stories and inspiring the ways that you adjusted to living and to loving a country, falling in love again with a country that is a part of all of us. And so thank you so much for sharing your stories and your experiences with us. What we'll do, anybody who would like to buy the book, of course, Aaron will sign it. And you can do that by emailing Steve at the email address that he'd sent out. And also I'm sending it out right now again in the chat so that everybody will be able to have the link. It's also available on our website. Right now, what we'll do is we'll again thank everyone for coming, and I'll allow people to unmute themselves, and we can have our cocktail hour minus the cocktails. So again, thank you all very much.